Transition. All right, welcome to Azure Community Live, an online meetup about Azure for the community, created by the community. I'm your host, Esteban Garcia. The idea behind this online meetup is for anyone, anywhere, with an internet connection to be able to be part of this Azure community. I live in Orlando, Florida. My co-hosts are in Netherlands and in Australia. And although we have a few different meetups here, I cannot always make those meetings. And of course, we're living in a different world right now. So it is great for me to be able to give back and provide you with amazing Azure content right at your home. And speaking of giving back, if you want to share your passion for Azure at whatever level, get in touch with us through Twitter, YouTube, and follow our call for speakers. I would love to have you here, whether you're a beginner speaker or if you're a world-renowned speaker. We'd love to have you here. For those of you who are watching live, feel free to post any questions on the chat window, and I'll relay them to Brian. So let me get to Brian. Today we have my friend Brian Randell on the show. He's a fellow Microsoft DevOps MVP, a world-renowned speaker, and it's an honor to have you with us. Brian, welcome to Azure Community Live. Tell us about yourself and tell us about what we'll be covering.
Well, hey, Esteban, great to see you. Nice that we're not too far apart on time zones, just 3 hours. I'm out on the West Coast of the United States. Again, thanks for having me. And today we're going to talk a little bit of DevOps. A little bit of background. I've been doing this a long time. I've got gray hair to show, if you can see it on the monitor. I've written some books. I do a podcast with Mickey Gusay, who was a former MVP like us, who is now a Microsoft employee. I've done a couple database DevOps course available on LinkedIn, and I'm a friend of Redgate, which means I spend too much time with databases. And as an MVP, it means I spend too much time playing with Azure DevOps and the Microsoft tool stack as well. So I'm excited to be here, and for me, building an app without a database is somewhat boring. So I love thinking about how to make working with databases easier. So that's the idea for today. So the agenda, learn something awesome. Okay, that was probably a punt, but the first thing, we always got to make sure we're a level set on DevOps. And when we think about DevOps, right, it's a bigger organizational transformation that requires everybody working together, thinking about how you're going to do it. So kind of that process, and we like to think that DevOps is often referred to as the second decade of Agile. And then with good products, working together, we can make this happen. So one of the pain points in working with databases is how do you change a very somewhat archaic style of development compared to modern code development. So if you think about writing with C# or Go or Java, etc., we've got these well-defined processes, both the inner loop for a developer in their IDE of choice, local compilation, maybe doing things like unit testing, etc., and then if you're using Visual Studio, for example, that F5 experience, right? And then taking it to that larger outer loop with a team, we have this notion of continuous integration where we can take the output of our compiled program and we can validate it and get it ready. And then we can use CD, continuous deployment, and take that output and deploy it into a shared dev environment, test, and even ultimately prod. And we've really got some mature processes there. But in the database world, particularly the relational database world, right? If you go look at some of the figures, relational databases still are, over 70% of the, active production work is done on them. And SQL Server is definitely in the top 10. And even SQL Database is been increasing in its usage. In fact, let me switch over really quick to a web browser. And if we come over here and go to, let's go to Google, we'll use Google today. And we'll look at SQL Database. And when you search for this, you get a lot of information here. But what we want is Azure SQL Database. And one thing that's important here is you'll notice they have this little box here that says, learn more about Azure SQL. So you click this, and this is one of those things to think about. When you think about keeping your database up in the cloud, Microsoft is going to give you lots of choices. And what you'll see here is, number one, a very traditional lift and shift pattern. I'm going to take my database and move it from on-prem into the cloud inside a virtual machine. That's going to give you the greatest compatibility and the most control, with the downsides of a lot more management, scaling, cost, etc. Then Microsoft has something kind of in between, what they call Azure SQL Managed Instance. And it's where you start moving into that PaaS world where Microsoft's going to take care of some of the grunt work for you, but they're going to give you more isolated control and give you more scaling options within your control. And then there's Azure SQL Databases, which I'm going to use here. I don't want to think about deploying my server. I don't want to think about managing it, patching it, etc. I want Microsoft to do that. And I want them to give me flexibility on how my workloads are priced and how I pay for them. And you'll see when we go to create my database server, how easy it is to do that. So understand that when we talk about database DevOps and talk about the cloud, there's a lot to learn. I'm going to focus on a very small portion today, which is kind of focused on getting started in that inner developer loop with how can I put my database under version control and how can I get a CI/CD pipeline set up for me with that long-term dream of maybe someday you can check in some code that changes your database and get it deployed to production all without human intervention. But for a lot of organizations, that's a long road. Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. That's that's definitely something that
think
a
you're
lot of
muted.
companies.
I caught Esteban off
Thank
guard.
you. No, yes, I 100% agree with you. I think it's definitely a roadmap that you have to create to be able to get there for sure.
So if we take a look at this visually, and I thank Redgate for the picture. They got an artist to make it look pretty. But you'll notice starting at the left side, there are a couple devs, and this is probably step one for a lot of organizations that they don't have, which is moving the definition of the database catalog, the structure, into some format that can be version controlled. In doing that, we change the typical model where developers, particularly in the SQL Server world, have often been focused on online development, where they're using tools like SSMS real time to make changes to the structure of the database. And then they work out ways to get that into different environments. And so what we want to do is separate the data from the structure. And we do that with tools that we're going to talk about. Now, once we have it in source control, that opens up this nirvana, this dream that, oh, well, that means if it's in source control, I could then use continuous integration, which means I could do builds. Now, for a lot of people, they might be wondering, well, what would you do to build SQL? Well, number one is doing things like code linting and code analysis. You can actually look at the structure of the serialized format of your database. And there's different ways to do this, to look for structural integrity, to look for mistakes, or even violations of rules that your company wants, all the way down to simply naming rules, right? People sometimes have some very strict ways what they want to do stuff. It basically provides that digital set of eyeballs to kind of look at it, kind of a review. So once we have it there, then we can hand off to some kind of release tool where we can then get the code into our different environments or stages. And we have a DBA there. And that might be a place where after we've got the package ready, the thing that we could use as a deployment vehicle, where a DBA could take a look at it and say, I'm not so sure, maybe I would do this differently, et cetera. And I understand this, having worked in systems, I started out on mini computers, where when you're talking about customers' data, you're talking about production data, DBAs tend to get very sensitive about changes coming in from developers. And so we want this to be a partnership, not necessarily an aggressive, we're going to step on your toes. And again, depending upon the type of application you're building, the data size, there's all sorts of things that happen in the release where I'm going to show you mostly what could happen just to make your shared development life easier as a developer. But the goal is that you could get, depending upon the type of application, you can get to that point where you have faith in your CI/CD pipeline and your processes to where you could check in changes and get it all the way out into your production environment without a human being involved. On the other hand, depending upon the environment, you may have these process points where someone steps in and says, this looks good, I approve, or no, this looks wrong, we need to double check it. Now, when you think about how you're going to do this, step one is we're going to look at a CI/CD pipeline, and we're going to focus on just one stage, but you can think about taking changes from one developer to shared dev to test and ultimately prod. And I'm going to use the Microsoft SQL Server Data Tools, aka SSDT. These come either with Visual Studio. So if you have Visual Studio 2019, they're available as an option to install. Or you can install them when you install SQL Server if you do it from the ISO media. This assumes you're going to do it on Windows. One of the big changes in 2017, of course, was Microsoft made the move to support Docker containers for SQL Server, and thus you can pull down an image directly. In addition, while the SSDT tools are focused on Windows still. Today, Microsoft has been making a lot of investment in their cross-platform Azure Data Studio, and they've been adding some new tools in preview to help you work with database changes, etc. So I'm excited to look forward to that. That means you'll be able to use it on Mac OS, Linux, as well as Windows. And then I'm going to use Azure DevOps pipelines. And you could use other tools. GitHub Actions would work here as well, Octopus Deploy. The bottom line is pick something that your team believes in and stick to it and use the same tools that you use to deploy your source code that ultimately becomes your application to take your database definition to ultimately be your live database. Now, other tools that I've used, Redgate's tools to replace SSDT, and Octopus Deploy is another product that I'm a big fan of if you want to manage your database deployments. Now, we think about working with the database then, right? Think about that typical model, right? If you fire up SQL Server Management Studio, you're going to connect to a server, maybe it's local, maybe it's a shared environment, and you're going to start partying on the database by either writing TSQL or you're going to sit there and use the GUI tools, which a lot of people like. The fundamental problem with that is that you have no management of it, and that's why tools like Redgate's SQL Source Control exist, and why Microsoft created SSDT. The idea with SSDT is that we're going to separate the database from its definition, and that's what we refer to as the model. And we're basically going to take what's called the catalog offline. A lot of people call it the schema, and while that is something that's commonly used, it's technically incorrect because in ANSI, we can partition a single database. In the ANSI definition for SQL, we can define a database so that it is broken up into schema. In fact, you see this when you look at a lot of the sample databases from Microsoft, like Worldwide Importers and the AdventureWorks database. So you have the DBO schema, the default schema, and then you have multiple application schemas. So I use the term catalog. We're basically going to take the definition of the database, which, by the way, we could do a subset. You don't have to do the whole database, but we're going to take it offline in a serialized format. We're basically going to break it down into a set of DDL entities, or data definition language entities. Basically, a table gets represented as a create table statement and supporting arguments. And then you might have indexes represented as their own file type. And thus, these serialized files as .sql can then be stored in version control. And then what happens is this project type that we use inside Visual Studio supports a publish command. And that publish command does two things. Two things. It compiles or packages your DDL entities into an XML model that is stored in what's called a DAC pack. And a DAC pack is just basically an overglorified zip that Microsoft uses as a transport mechanism to move around these definitions. You may also see backpacks, which include basically the DAC pack definition plus the data, and that's a backup format. The other thing the tools will do, though, is they will let you output just a big SQL script. And that SQL script then can be reviewed by a DBA, etc. And then the idea is that by having this DAC pack, which represents the database definition as a model, they can then use a tool that's effectively called, it's often just referred to by its exe name, SQL package. It's part of the DACFX toolkit. And what it basically does is it'll walk up to the target that you're going to do a deployment to and says, hey, I have a database that looks like this, often referred to as the golden schema. And it says, I want to have these 20 tables, these views, these stored procedures, etc. And it says, target, what do you have? And if there's nothing there, it then just generates an entirely new database. On the other hand, if there are existing entities in there, it will run a comparison of the existing golden schema model, in other words, what the developer wants it to be like, against a materialized model in memory of what the database currently looks like. And it basically will figure out, could I update this, and can I do it safely? The default behavior is that if there is going to be any possible data loss, then they will block and fail. Now, you can override this, and then there becomes all this magic of what happens when I need to make a change that could cause data loss. How do I migrate? And that's where it gets all sorts of nasty. We'll talk about that later. But in either case, this is the approach I'm going to show you here. Now, there is another approach that's also very popular, and that is migrations. If you want a good example from Microsoft, the Entity Framework Core does this, as well as the previous Entity Framework version on .NET FX. The idea is that we're going to store changes to the database as a set of sequenced migrations. So as we make changes, we save those changes and deploy them to our database, and that becomes a baseline. Then from then on, every time we make a change in the model or definition, we then update the database, and that's stored in a migration table. And there's this table that tracks the changes over time. So when it's time to do a deployment, you walk up to the target and say, what migration are you on? And the database says, I'm on migration 20. And the model says, well, I've got migrations up to 30. And it will go through and play back the migrations in sequence. This is basically a way to define the database via object relational modeling, or an ORM. And the whole idea is that you're migrating changes from the model in a step-by-step. In addition, you could actually not go all the way, right? With the golden schema, it's kind of an all-or-nothing approach. Redgate SQL Change Automation, formerly known as ReadyRoll, uses migrations, and there are other products out there as well that do this type of stuff. There's no right one. People have strong opinions on this, and it really depends on where you're coming from. In particular, there's this approach of, I'm more of a database person, and so I'm going to look at tools like the Redgate tools or maybe SSDT. And then there's other people who are like, look, I know there's this thing called SQL Server, but I'm more concerned with using it for persistence, and they like the more object-driven approach. And then there's the people that are hybrid, which like both, and like, okay, well, maybe I want to manage the tables and views with a tool, but I'm going to use stored procedures on my own or something like that. So there's lots of ways to approach it. Again, we can spend weeks on this.
Hey, Brian, is there a profile of a team? Like if you're thinking about getting started with this, is it like if you're more familiar with SQL, one model works better for you? If you're more like, where should people start?
Yeah, so number one, the number one problem I run into is people budgets. So SSDT wins out a lot in Microsoft shops because it's free, right? It's included. So basically, you can get SQL Server Developer Edition for free, and it comes with SSDT, or obviously if you have Visual Studio, even the Community Edition has it. So that drives decisions, unfortunately, number one. Number two, it's the experience that people have with the database. I'm an old fart, and I've been doing databases since the 80s. And so for me, I learned a lot about relational database design. I understand what normal forms are and things like that. And I also look to where I can build programmability into the database. So things like store procedures, user-defined functions, etc., where I really can use the power of the database. A lot of people, they understand the concept. I want to store some data. I don't understand maybe even indexes. I mean, you go into see a lot of databases, and so it's going to be an experience there. EF Core really has impressed me. I'm actually doing a project with another MVP, and we're using EF Core with a web app, and it's been really nice to work with. I'm really impressed with it overall. I still have some hard times with it because it's not the way I always work with things. But the fact that you can still use your programmable objects like store procedures, et cetera, with EF, I think is a really nice combination. If people have access to the Redgate tools, that changes the conversation dramatically. Then I really start to look at the complexity of their database, how often they want to make changes, is the database shared, et cetera. And that's when we start looking at tools like SQL Change Automation, I think is really good there. Once again, it's experience and comfort with the database. And the more they're going to try and get out of the database is where I push them more to the tools. Again, the other way to do it is you can factor things. You don't have to do an all or nothing approach. For example, you can manage your database structure with SQL source control from Redgate, for example, and then use SQL Change Automation just for your programmable objects. So it really depends on the people, but definitely I would just say it's driven number one by money. And so SSDT I've done a lot with.
That makes sense.
Yeah, no problem. So enough blabbing. In fact, you can even hide my ugly mug. I've been kind of slouching down so you don't have to see me that much. But let's go through and do some demos of this, and then we'll talk about some more issues beyond what I'm going to demo. So naturally, we need a database in Azure. And so I'm going to come over here to Home, and I'm going to say Create a Resource. And you can see SQL Database, quite popular, so it's right on the top menu. And so we have a couple things you have to define, right? When you work with Azure, Most things, except things like the directory, etc., are logically grouped into a resource group. So I'm going to create a new group. You can see I did a prep test to make sure everything was working. And we'll call this ACL for Azure Community Live 2020. How about live? Maybe I'll do even live May in case you have me back. But in either case.
Well,
all right, so we'll do that for the name of the resource group, and we will then come over here, and I need a server, and I need a database name. So I want a database that not only has a structure, but some data. And while I could build it by hand, that would be incredibly boring. So what we're going to do is we're going to use AdventureWorks LT Live, and what we'll see is that that's already built in as an option we can choose. Now I have an existing server I can pick, which I will do because that way we don't have to wait for it to be created. But I'm going to point out that when you create a new database, you have to watch out. Microsoft is going to let you fill in some information here. And after you fill in this information, you're then going to specify the size. And it's this kind of non-intuitive approach. When you think about starting with SQL Server, it's number one is, okay, I'm going to need a particular license type. So maybe enterprise versus standard for production use. And then you're going to choose the type of hardware to run it on. And then all your databases get that benefit. In Azure, it's different. You actually pay based upon how much horsepower you want a database to have. So you can actually define a server one way and define your database to have more performance one way or the other. So if I were to come here and define this, let's do ACL 2020 live. Okay, it looks like that's good. We'll do a user. I'll put a temp password here. And then, of course, I have to tell it where I want. Now, I'm using a VM that's actually in Azure, and so I'm going to pick South Central. That's the closest place to my VM. And I'll click OK. Now, when I do that, it says, OK, great, we're going to build you this new server, but then how much money do you want to give us? In other words, how much horsepower do you want? Now, the default is something you got to watch out for as a developer, because this default point right here is going to cost you about $426 US a month. Now, by comparison, what I normally have people start with when they're doing basic development to get started is a standard instance at an S0, which is only $15 a month. So that default is really going to burn up your MSDN subscription, or it's going to cost you money on the old credit card or PO very quickly. I find for doing basic development, standard works fine, and you can always add some more DTUs, which a DTU is a weird thing in that it's a database transaction unit, and it basically is a combination of quality of service based upon processing power and I/O and memory in use with the database. So definitely RTFM the docs. The bottom line is Microsoft will let you choose kind of two approaches. Number one, kind of a well-defined amount of processing, or they even have serverless databases now, which I haven't used in production now, but they look really interesting to where you can actually pay literally per minute. But I'm just going to use standard here, click apply, and I'll hit review and create, and we'll hit create. There's a couple other options around networking, particularly if you're going to set up VNets and virtual LANs, etc. So that's going to create the database, and when it's done, I'm going to make a couple minor changes so that I can work with it effectively. Now, out of the box, when you first create a SQL database, it asks you for a username and password, and that's going to be basically the SA. In the shared model, you can't call it SA because they really have an SA behind the scenes, and you're using, remember, we're using a PaaS environment. That means we're using a shared environment. So it's possible our database is running on a server with someone else. So your SQL admin really is the account admin for your instance of that SQL server, and then that's also becomes the master control username and password for your database. However, we now can use Azure Active Directory integration for both development and for our application runtime. In fact, they even support things like managed service principals logging in. So we've got a much better state to work with now. So you can see that the database server was created, and it's now generating the database, which I believe I wasn't paying attention when I was talking, and I clicked through it, and I didn't put any data in there, Esteban. Well, guess what? We'll show them how to create a second database really quickly as soon as this finishes.
Perfect.
I got excited, and I hit next too quickly. In fact, I can start this while it's finishing up since my server's already there. So I'm going to come over here and create a resource. We'll click the database again. And we're going to pick that existing resource group. We'll call this ADV Works LT with data. And I'll pick that live server. I'll hit the next options for networking, and we'll leave that alone. Additional settings, we want sample data. Need to pick that option right there. And we'll hit next and review and create, and we'll create. So that'll actually give me a database with data. Okay, so
it was just an opportunity for you to show everyone how to do it.
Exactly.
Way, right?
Yeah,
so
you can do that. And that's the key thing. Once you create the server, you can, of course, add multiple databases. I want to show you creating a server doesn't take that long when you use the PaaS environment, which is nice. So now if we come over here to my resource groups, we should find that live group. There we go. And what we can do is go into deployments and take a look at what's going on to see if we're working. So you can see right now that my initial deployment worked fine. And now it's doing one more deployment. So we can come here and watch that. Looks like it just finished. Almost there. It's loading the database up with data. This is a good way to see, what's it really doing? It's always, what's going on. And then, of course, you can come over here to the bells and see different status items. And so we can say dismiss completed. Almost there. All right. While that finishes up, the step one is I want to be able to access this database and database server with my brianr@mcwtech.com credentials. I don't want to have to use that SQL admin and that password in plain text, especially while I'm doing development on my machine. So what I can do is go to the server, and you're going to see that we have an option now with the server for an Active Directory admin. And this is step one in the process. Once you do this, there's additional work you have to do to add additional users. But I'm doing this kind of inner loop for just the developer at this point. So I'm just going to set myself as the admin. Now, understand when you do this, you have to use an org ID. For various reasons, the subscription I'm using, which is provided by the kindness of Microsoft, had to be set up with my MSA. And so my MCW Tech account, which is my org ID, is a guest. But that's fine. It's an org ID, and I can set that as the Active Directory admin. So I'm going to save that. Now, once I've done that, and we'll let it finish, I want to be able to get to it from tools like SSMS and Visual Studio. And I swear I clicked Set Admin and save. Let me go out. There it is. Okay, just didn't update the UI correctly. Okay, so I'm now in there. So now if we come back over here to my server, look at my databases, we see I have two databases in here. One called ADV Works LT Live, which has nothing in it. Oh, and look how exciting. I wasn't paying attention here, and there you can see that my database is very large. So we'll be shutting this down at the end of the demo.
An expensive demo.
Exactly, that's fine. It turns out if you do the math, it comes out to like 50 cents an hour as opposed to 2 cents an hour. So for the demo, I can spend $1 on you guys. All right, I love you.
We appreciate that.
I'm a giver. And so one of the things we can do in here is you can go to the query editor, which gives you kind of a UI, and then this is where we get to the fun part about firewalls. So even though I'm talking to the Azure portal is going to run client script inside the browser, and it says, hey, you're running on this IP address range here, and we're not going to let you get in. So it turns out I need to come over to Overview, and there's an option here for the firewall up on the server. So I come over here, find my server, go back up to the server, and then up here in the Overview, there's an option for the firewall settings. Now, there's a couple things to be aware of. Number one is, do you want to let other Azure services have access? This is often something you would do if you wanted to have an app service in the same resource group access the database. You might not do this, though, if you're going to do your own virtual private network where you control exactly which IPs and which servers have access to each other. So once again, Microsoft's going to give you lots of control on the security front to protect your data in your database. That said, I do need my client IP to get access, so I'll click the button up here called Add Client IP, And I can just put Brian's, give it a name, hit save. And now once I've done that, I can go back into my database. Get a hold of the query editor tools, continue with my logged in credentials, expand the tables, and what we should see is, there we go, we have our sales LT customer. So I can come over here, select star from. I love the idea of them giving me IntelliSense in a web browser. That's just, this query completion is awesome. And we run it, and we can see that I now have a database with tables and with some data. All right, so I can do that in the web browser, but what I want to do is separate this definition from this data. So to do that, I'm going to come over to Visual Studio, and I'm going to say File New and just get working, or am I? See, here's the problem. I want to be a good DevOps person, and a couple things. Number one, I know I want to use version control. Number two, I really should have kind of a roadmap, a plan for what I'm doing. And, if I'm really being good, I might be a good agile person and be transparent and set up some kind of task board which tells my stakeholders what I'm doing, what I'm working on, and sharing with my team, because I don't want to work by myself. So to do that, I'm going to come over here and go to Azure DevOps and create a new team. And a team project is a place that you can store your code and demos, as well as track your work. And if I do advanced, you'll see I'm going to use Git and Scrum. You could use TFVC, and you could use other processes, whatever makes you happy. Now, once I do that, I want to do just enough project management. And that's going to be in the form of defining kind of a business case. And in this case, it's going to be more of a technical case, not really a business case. And a work item to track my work. So come over here to boards, and we'll come over here to the backlog, and we'll say new work item. We'll do something like that. And what we'll do is we'll create a task. Don't judge me, it's not a great task. Remaining work, everything takes an hour, and we'll save it. Now, I don't want to work by myself, so what we're going to do is we'll invite a friend. Turns out there's other Brians in the world. There's this Brian, my Brian Randell at Outlook. So we'll add that person. Then I can come back over here to my backlog, and we'll make the other Brian the product owner. So we'll say that the team's gonna agree to be committed, that we'll forecast this work. They really need to update the template. Don't you agree, Esteban?
100%.
And then we'll do that. And then we can come over here to the task board. And when I go to the task board, it's going to be upset and say I don't have iteration dates. So we're going to set up a micro sprint. We'll get this done by tomorrow. There we go. And I'm going to do the work. Okay, so once again, just enough project management. Why do I like to do this? I don't do it for timesheets. I don't do it for anybody. Well, I do it for some people because they make me, because they pay me. Let's be honest. I like money. But the reality is that I'm doing this for my old brain. It will help me understand what I did and why I did it. The yellow task represents my internal tracking of what I need to do and what my team needs to do. The blue item, the PBI or product backlog item, is all about defining the value that is delivered to the user. Now, sometimes the value isn't apparent. Version control database probably doesn't mean much to your users. There's ways to mention that. This falls often into the category of technical debt. We should have been doing this. We weren't, so now we're doing it. So we often spend that somewhere else under, data integrity protection, quality of service enhancements. There's ways to do it to where you're delivering value by cleaning up your business. So now we've got that. Now I can go work with code, and you'll see it says, hey, you got an empty repo. What would you like to do? Well, I'm going to be using Visual Studio, so I'm going to add a git ignore file to keep out the nasty intermediate files. I'll initialize it with a README, and we're now good to go. So now I can go over to Visual Studio, go to Team Explorer, go to the connectoid, and select Manage Connections, and I'm going to connect to that team project. So it's going to take a second. It's hard to see, but it's actually pulsing this little bar here. You get a little bit of yellow. Slow it down on the freeze frame, folks, on the video, and you'll see that pop through. And so my team project is buried up in a organization called Prep 1809. There's a story behind that, but that requires beverages. And then there you'll see ACL 2020 live. Now, I don't like the default location, so I actually have a directory. Since I'm a multi-talented person with multiple personalities, I partition my folders so that it's the local user and then the online user and then the org name followed by the repo name. So I'll hit clone, and that's going to initialize and bring down the README and the get-ignore file. And at this point, I'm ready to actually do the part that has something. Oh, error encountered. S channel failed to receive handshake. SSL TLS connection failed. Well, that's what every developer loves to see. Okay, so let's do this. Often what happens there is that could be a token issue. So we'll see if it'll let me get away with just doing this again. If not, what I'll do is I'll close Visual Studio and re-log in. I'm actually surprised, but not completely surprised because it is software. There we go. Okay, so I've got my get ignore and my readme, but I have no code. And my dream is to work with that database the right way. So what I'm going to do here is come over to the File menu and select a new project. And if it's not obvious, I'm in Visual Studio 2019. I do know how to use a mouse. And you'll see I've filtered it down already to an SQL Server database project. That's under query language on Windows. Naturally, if you change this, you can see other wonderful projects and languages, etc. But we're going to focus on just that right now. I'll hit next. I need a name. And so the database, if I remember correctly, had a tour de force name of creativity that I can't remember, so I'm going to go back and look at it. It's ADVWorks LT with data. So we'll copy that name, and that's what we're going to call the project. Not required, but it makes my soul happy to have things consistent. Now, where am I going to put it? Well, I'm going to put it down somewhere like there, but not in the prep folder. Instead, we're going to put it in the live one. So we're going to drill down into live. And in fact, I like to keep things in an SRC folder. You might have docs and utilities and other garbage you throw in there. And then you can leave the solution name the same or whatever you want it to be. I'll call it ACL 2020 live just to show you the difference. And I'll hit create. And you're going to be more than impressed by the magic in the tools. Nothing. It's probably the disconcerting thing. You do this and nothing happens. And they used to run a wizard, and for various reasons they changed that. So what you have to do is you have to decide, do you want to come in through the project, or you can actually come in via the Server Explorer SQL Object Explorer. I usually just do it from the project depending upon how I'm doing it. Now understand what we're trying to do. We need to get a copy of the database structure. Now, some of us will have access to production, and that may be kind of scary if you're just a developer. Then again, you might be the developer DBA and owner of the company, right? Esteban and myself both have been, what's the word? Not startup, but we've run our own businesses. There's a word for that, but anyway.
Yeah.
In either case,
I don't know.
when you do it all, it's okay, but sometimes someone else might be in the way, and the tools will help you deal with that. When you do an import, you'll notice that there are three choices here: data tier application, database, and script. Database requires a live connection to the server, which is what I'm going to use. The other two don't. They let you import from a file. The key thing is in both cases, this can be something that is given to you by a DBA, for example. They can export a DAC pack for you, or they could give you a SQL script. When you pick database, that's going to say, okay, let's go import it. Let me talk to your database. And so you come over here and click Show Connection Properties, and you need your server name. So if we go back over here to my web browser, and we come over here to Overview, it's going to tell me the name of my server right there. So we're going to copy that to the clipboard. We'll paste that in, and then we're going to change the authentication to Active Directory interactive authentication. Now, if you're not able to do the Active Directory trick that I did earlier, you would use SQL Server authentication and put SQL admin followed by your password. Or, of course, if you created other users, you could use them as well. But I'm going to come down here and pick Active Directory Interactive, and then I have to provide my alias. And then what will happen here is when I click the drop down here, it's going to prompt me for my credentials. Now, just so you know, if you hadn't opened up the firewall, Visual Studio is smart enough to say, hey, I can't talk to the server. Would you like me to try and open the firewall for you? Which is really nice, but it takes a little longer. If you just do it the way I did through the UI, it's a little quicker. Now I can click the drop down, and sure enough, there's my database with data. So I'll hit connect, and there's some options you can set, but the bottom line is if I hit start, it's going to go up to the server and say, knock, knock. It's going to say, who's there? It's going to say, Brian at mcwtech.com, who happens to be an admin. Great. Tell me all about the database structure. And it does that and then sucks it in. And basically, it shreds the database into those individual DDL components. And so if we take a look under Sales LT and under Tables, there's that customer table represented as a .SQL file. The nice thing is they upgraded the tools a few years back so that not only do you see the raw SQL, but you get the visual designer, allowing you to make changes and work with it. So at this point, this is my baseline. So what I'm going to do is save this to version control. So I'll click on changes, and I'll say add copy of database catalog as of, and I'll do this from, and put the name of the server I got it from. Okay. Now, I'm going to save these changes. Now, if we take a look, I've got all these changes, so I'm going to stage them because I do want all of them. It's going to ask me to save my project file. And then I want to relate it to that work because I want to associate everything I do with a work item. Once again, it's to help my brain remember what I did. It's all about that traceability. So I can come over here. There's a couple ways I can get this. I go to Team Explorer. If I can't remember, I can click on work items. And it'll go and show me, oh, 257, track and version control. Great, that's the one I want. So I'll come over here, click plus. You can also start typing. It'll look it up. They've done some nice work. And we'll click add. Now that I've done that, I can commit my changes. And because we're using Git, I've just saved it locally. I haven't shared it with the server. Now, if I want to share with the server, of course, then I come over here to sync. And once I get sync, I can push the change up. And once I've done that, we can go up and see that up in Azure DevOps. So let's go back over to there. Refresh the repos. And now if we look at history, we can see my files. And if we go look at them, as I mentioned, our database is completely represented as a bunch of .SQL files. Okay, take a look. It'll show it to us. There we go.
And Brian, so far, you're not using anything that's not out of the box of Visual Studio.
Everything,
right?
yep, everything is part of Visual Studio. And between the free Azure accounts and Community Edition of Visual Studio and free versions of SQL Server, you can get everything I have, and it doesn't cost you a penny at this point. Or if you have money, though, that Microsoft will take your money. All right. So at this point, I'm going to do what every developer should do the minute they get some code up into version control. I'm going to set up a build. Now to do that, I'm going to go over here to pipelines, and I'm going to click on the pipelines option. It's going to say, hey, create your first pipeline. Yes, I will. And then it's going to give me this list of where's your code. And if I start walking through it, you keep seeing this word YAML. And I'm like, what is that going to do for me? And then I look at this and go, Here's the thing. YAML has a lot of value, and it's something that just recently went full GA for both build and release in Azure DevOps. It's what they call multi-stage pipelines. However, I find it's not the best way to teach people, mostly because it's very code-driven, and it provides some more advanced options. I think it's great. But when I'm showing people the ropes initially, I like to use the GUI tool. So we'll go back here to pipelines. Say create pipeline. We're going to go with the classic editor. Again, I'm kind of old, so we'll do that approach. And here it's going to say, okay, where's your code? Fine, all looks good. But then you're going to have a choice of these templates we can pick. And unfortunately, there isn't one that says database. So I'm going to cheat, though, and pick the one that says ASP.NET. And I'll explain why in a second. Now I'm going to hit apply. And what we're going to get is our build pipeline definition. And it's basically made up of two key definitions. Number one, where's the build going to run? And number two, what's it going to do? And what's it going to do is represented by a set of task-based sequenced items. So we'll run these items in order as part of what's called a job. By default, one pipeline has one job, but you can click the old plus button up here and you can add more agent jobs. When would you want to do that? Primary reason is you have a common code base that gets compiled against different platforms. So maybe Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, and they actually have platform-specific binaries. Another thing is you have a very large project and you want to fan out and use multiple agents. So you want greater concurrency. Mobile development, Xamarin is a good example, iOS and Android. And you want to build on iOS, of course, has to be built on a Mac, whereas Android can be built on both Linux and Windows. You can also add an agentless job, and an agentless job is basically you need a human involved for some reason. The one place where I've seen that used is with working with mainframes. So that's fun. So in either case, though, we have what we need here, except because my solution is just SSDT, I don't have NuGet. So I'm going to take away those steps because I don't need them to happen. Now, we'll talk about testing in a second. I'm going to just disable it. I probably won't do it, but I'll talk about the pros and cons of database testing in a second while the build runs. I have no symbols really to publish, so we'll remove that. And then I do want the published artifact. Now, what is going on here? The build step is going to do the moral equivalent to the publish step, in that it's going to take all those .SQL files and it's going to generate that DACPack model. And you're like, model? What does that look like, Brian? Okay, well, let's go back over to Visual Studio and let's build. Now, see it built out a file called ADVWorks LT with data.DACPack. So if I go to Solution Explorer, open this up in the file system, and if we rename this to .zip, we're going to open it up, and what you'll see is it's just some XML files. Most notably, one called model.xml. And if we open that up in Visual Studio Code, come on, there we go. We'll see a bunch of XML, and as we keep going, we start seeing things that look like definitions for objects. If we go all the way down and come back up, we should even see some embedded T-SQL in here, I think, at one point. There we go. So this represents what the database should look like in an XML file. Once again, they use this to load an in-memory model of the golden schema or catalog, and then when they go to the target, they try and build one in memory as well. That's how it's going to be able to do a comparison and how it does its updates. So we need that DACPack file, which is what's going to happen when we run this build operation. Now, when I first do the build, then I need to select my solution. So I'll come over here to the pipeline, and I'll pick my solution. Oops, there it is. Now, as part of the solution, they've got some switches on. I don't necessarily need all of them, but the key thing is when it does build, it's going to output that DACPack for me. Now, the problem is where it outputs the DACPack isn't going to get picked up automatically by the build. And so I have to come over here and add an extra task called the copy task. And I'm basically going to go find that DACPack and copy it from the folder it's in into a folder so that it gets uploaded with the published artifact. Because the idea is once the output is done and it's successful, we want to take that DACPack and put it somewhere in Azure DevOps so we have access to it later to do our continuous deployment. So what I'm going to do now then is I need to copy from somewhere to somewhere. Well, it turns out we have magic variables, right? We don't want to try and hard code some path because we don't know where this is going to be on the build agent. And understand, I'm going to use the build agents provided by Microsoft on the cloud. You can self-host with another VM in the cloud yourself, or I can install the build agent on my local machine as well. So it's up to you where you want your code to run. But since I'm going to use the one in Azure, I don't know the file system. So by using the build sources directory, I'm going to tell it, hey, go through and scan some directories for me. And I can do that with this star.star, but I don't want to copy everything. So instead, I'm going to say, go look in any folder that starts with bin and then has a matching folder that matches the build configuration, which is another build variable. And then I'm going to say, you know what? I want you to copy the DAC pack file. This is a little indirect. You could be more specific, but this will work. And then I need to put it in what's called the build artifact staging directory. You'd be like, well, Brian, how did you know it needed to be in that folder? Well, if we look at publish artifact, it's pointed from there. So I knew it needed to come from there to go in there. Now, the build sources, once again, this is just a matter of RTFMing, going to the docs and seeing what variables will tell us about the path structure. Okay, so we build it. That's going to output the DAC pack. Then let's copy the DAC pack into a staging folder. Then take the output of the staging folder and put it up into Azure DevOps in a slot called drop linked to this particular build pipeline. Now I'm going to change the build pipeline to match my project a little better, which was ACL 2020 Live. So we'll just get rid of the ASP.NET since it's not really that. We'll save it, provide a good comment. And then we're ready to go, except for, one thing. Here's the problem. It's going to traverse this directory tree to find that DAC pack. The problem is if you don't tell it, it's going to copy it into that target folder with all the path information. So under advanced, there's an extra option here. Flatten folders, my friends. So we're going to save this, and we'll call this add flatten folders with 2 T's. I know how to spell. Option. And a cool thing about this, when you save the definition, if you go to history, you can see all the changes I made. You can even diff them. And you can see they store this type of build definition as JSON. If you choose YAML, of course, your build definition will be stored as YAML, and you would diff the YAML. All right, now I can queue up a build. And it wants to run on VS 2017 with 2019. And I didn't think about this, so I'm going to change it to 2019 to match. And we'll click run. For this project, it should just work, but we'll be safe. So what happens is it's now going to go up to Azure and say, I need a build agent. And it says, hold on, let me go get you one for you. So it's currently queued. Now it's going to initialize the job. It's going to check it out. It's going to build it. And then hopefully it's going to find my output and copy it up to the server. So we'll give this a couple seconds. And one of the great things about doing this is it will tell me at the end what went into this build. So it'll list all of the commits, as well as it will give me any information about the work items I linked to. So I get that great traceability about knowing what went into this build and why did someone do the build in the first place. Now, while this is running, we're going to have to think about the next step, which is if I make changes, I want to deploy those changes up to Azure and to my database structure. To do that, I'm going to have to create a release pipeline. However, that release pipeline is going to need to talk to Azure on my behalf. Remember, I'm not going to be sitting there, late at night doing the deployment. That would be kind of sucky. And so in order to do that, what we have to do is set up what's called a service connection. So I'm going to do this as another user while that runs. And we'll come into ACL 2020 Live and go to project settings. And under the pipelines section, we're going to find something called service connections. Service connections allow you to define a programmatic connection between Azure DevOps and some other service. And so when I hit create service connection, it's going to give you a choice of a bunch of different services. And you can see things like Kubernetes, GitHub, Docker, the Docker registry. And as you'd expect, Azure is represented well here. And since we're using a modern version of Azure, we're going to use Azure Resource Manager. We'll hit next. Lots of different ways to do this depending upon how locked down your particular subscription is. The easiest thing to do as a dev, remember your dev inner loop. I'm not talking about production here. I'm just talking about that inner dev loop, is just to use Service Principal Automatic, assuming you are a global admin in the sub. If you're not, you might have to do the manual approach, or you might have to get an admin to do this for you. In either case, I'll hit next. It's going to go take my credentials and say, okay, which subscriptions do you have available to you? And we'll give it a second. And in a moment, we should see my subscriptions show up. Someday, there we go. Now, note that I set the subscription, I can restrict it to a particular resource group. So I could say you're only going to talk to ACL 2020 Live May, and I'll do that, but you also can make it available to the whole subscription. We'll call this eMVP. All right, and then you have to, I'm going to grant access permission to all of it. Again, you can control things at a more granular level based upon your needs. Now, once that's available, I'll then be able to create the release definition. But there's one extra thing I need as well. If you recall, I've been logging in with my credentials, brian@mcwtech.com. It's been passing through my credentials via Azure Active Directory. I'm not going to be able to do that when I want to deploy the database. I'm going to need to talk to it with a standard connection. So what I'm going to do is go back into the project here, and I'm going to come over here to pipelines, and here's something that an admin can do. I can come over here into the library, and I could create a variable group. And in this variable group, I could say, SQL passwords. And I could then add one here and say SQL admin, and I can provide a value like password. But if I did that, you guys would know my password. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to leave the screen there, but I'm going to come over to another browser off screen. Sorry, folks. And then I'm going to come over, and I'm going to change that password, and we're going to refresh the screen. So we'll come over here to library. I'm doing this off screen again, just if you're wondering why you can't see him do anything. And now I'm going to come in here. And you'll notice there's a little lock there. Well, I've clicked the lock off screen, and I'm saving it. Now, if I refresh the screen, you'll notice it comes back with stars. Now, if I click the lock, guess what? You can't see it. Right, so it's one-way encrypted in, which is nice. So I'm going to go away, say leave. Now that password will be available to me when I need to set my release pipeline. Now let's go back and see if our build succeeded. Yes, we got green check boxes, or if you look at the little tick, if you have some color issues, the bottom line is that is successful. You'll see where I built it, out of which repo, what branch, and what the initial SHA value is for that commit. Shows you when it was, how long it took. You'll see one work item. Okay, there's the work item I linked to it. And if we come back over here, we'll see that it published one item into the drop, and there's my DAC pack. So at this point, I could look at the output. I could hand it off to my admin. They could take a look at it. They could run it on a test server, whatever. But if I'm feeling good about what I've done, I can now come in and create a release pipeline. So once again, you can do this all in YAML now, but I'm going to show you the GUI mechanism. It turns out that there isn't a database template for Azure Databases. There is for on-prem, but they didn't choose one here. But it turns out it's only one task. So we'll just do an empty job, and we're going to tell it what we're going to use as input. Input is represented what are called artifacts. And an artifact can come from different build systems. It doesn't just have to come from Azure DevOps, but naturally it's going to work really well with Azure DevOps. You can actually pull data out of Azure repos, out of GitHub, TFVC. You can even pull them off file shares if you want to get really exotic. But the idea is that I want to pull data from the output of this pipeline. And I'm going to give it a name and click Add. Now, any of the data that's in this pipeline output is going to be available to my stages. Now, my stage is called Stage 1, but I'm going to call this Private Dev. And now I'm going to close this. And then I'm going to click the link here, and it's going to look very similar. It's a pipeline. It's going to have an agent that's going to do some steps. And again, just like before, I can add another agent. So I can have multiple deployments going on at once. I'm then going to add a task, and the task I'm going to do is SQL based. So we'll look for SQL, and they have a well-defined task for Azure SQL Database deployments. So I'm going to add that in, and it's going to say, okay, what are you going to deploy to? So first of all, what's the Azure subscription? So I'll click the drop down. There's my service connection. Now I can choose how we're going to do things here, but we're going to do SQL authentication. And I need the name of my server again, so we'll go back over, other tab. It's right here. Copy that server name. Go back to the tab, paste in the server name. Now, the database is fun. If the database doesn't exist, it will be created. So I could just put a database name there, but we're going to, I could put a different one, but we're going to use our existing database because I want to show you doing updates. So we'll go back into our databases. Copy the name. I keep alt-tabbing when I just need to do a tab. Paste that in. Now we do SQL admin, but instead of hard coding our password in here, we're going to use that variable. And you wrap your variables in $ open paren, variable name, like that. And so if I go to the other browser, I called it SQL admin. Probably should have called it SQL password, but that's fine. And last but not least, I need the DAC pack. So we click the ... expand, click it, click OK. And that's it. There's lots of other options. Again, I'm showing you just, once again, the narrow band of doing this. We'll click Save. Now, if I were to run this, it should just work, but we wouldn't see any changes. In fact, it actually might fail because I realized I skipped a step. So this actually gives us a great reason to turn on CI/CD. So first of all, turning on CD means clicking on the artifact and saying, hey, if this artifact provides an update and it's successful, kick off the release. So we're going to turn that on. And better yet, let's go back over to our build, which we know works. And let's go over here and edit it and turn on CI, continuous integration, which means when I push code up here, we'll run the build as well. So we'll turn on CI. So we're going to do two things here, Esteban. Number one, we're going to make a change. So let's go over to the customer table and let's add a new field like is VIP. We'll make it a bit. We'll allow it to be null, and we'll set the default to 0, which is false. We'll save that, and notice it did all the updates down there in T-SQL so I can see it, which is how I'm able to diff that using things like version control, right? So I can right-click, compare with unmodified. We'll see the change. We can also see what a change script would look like. One way to do that is to come over here to the Tools menu, and you'll see under SQL Server, there's a schema comparison option, which brings us to talking to different databases and versions of what does SSDT support. Well, it turns out when I created it, it specifies the target platform as SQL Server 2016. That would fail if I tried to deploy it. So we're going to change it to Microsoft Azure SQL Database. So we're going to save that. And you'll note there's also this option to create a script when you build. This is something you can hand off to your DBA in case they don't want to deal with DAC packs. Now let's just try out the compare tools really quick and see basically in a GUI what's going to happen when we do the deployment. We'll specify the source. Now our source in this case is our project. In the case of the release pipeline, it's going to be the DAC pack. The target, of course, is going to be our target server. So I'll go select it. And basically, when I click compare, this is what they'll do in memory via SQL package, and they'll compare the two models. And what will happen is it's going to say, hey, everything's the same except in the customers table, there's been a change. And it looks like this. They'll look at that change and they'll say, this looks like a safe change. And so that's how they will do the update. And in fact, what they'll do is they will they will update the target just as if I click the button here. But I'm not going to say that here. You'll note that I can say generate a script, and this will show you what the update script would look like. So even if you don't, even if you're running into an environment where your DBAs won't trust a tool to do it, you can use a tool to get you most of the way there. So, oh, and by the way, just for you, Esteban.
So Brian, now you're.
There you go.
Oh.
Go ahead.
So now you're moving away from emailing someone's script or taking a script or just having the DBA guess what changes have been made. Now you're actually saying my changes are going to version control, and if a developer wants to work with this, they can just pull the changes down and just keep going. Just
exactly.
Like
you have lots of flexibility now. Once again, you can embrace this model. I'm trying to show you the CI/CD pipeline, or you can break it up where you need to have that human trust and build that relationship. Exactly. So add customer, awesome. VIP customer field and update project. Okay, so we'll add our work item again, which I believe, let's see, there we go, 257. Stage our changes. I'm going to go for broke here, commit staged, and we're going to push that up. So when we do that, we now should see my build kick off. There it is. And we'll let this run. And remember, this is going to only at this point go through and generate the DAC pack. Now, I could do other things here. I could run various T-SQL validation scripts. I could turn on tools that come with the code analysis features in SQL. It's got an SSDT. There's also third-party analysis tools. I could also run database tests, or could I? When I think about database unit tests, those are things that would test the database objects that do programming style features, so store procedures, user-defined functions, etc. SSDT does support doing unit tests that way. In addition, there's tools like T-SQL-T or SQL Test from Redgate. The problem with testing databases is this. A, it's hard. Most people just can't be bothered to do it. Also, because most database tests require a database instance in a server with data, I view that more of a release stage. And so I tend to think of them more as integration tests, not unit tests. And I would do those via releases. And I can show you an example of what I've already done before we leave. But that looked like it worked. So now, if I come over here and look at things, I've got a release pipeline running. So let's see if it works.
Hey, Brian, while you're at it, while we wait for this, since you mentioned data, and I know we probably won't have time to show it, but are you able to work with data as part of the DAC pack, and you make data changes and then deploy them as part of this as well, or is it just the schema?
The core design is just the definition, the catalog, the schema. However, you have the ability to run pre and post processing scripts, and so your post processing scripts are a good place to load static data, lookup data, those type of things. You just basically set those in as a set of inserts. So I've seen lots of people do that. In addition, you could, it blew up. Unable to connect. Please verify the connection information. Okay, I must have got the username and password right. So let's verify that I can connect, that I didn't screw up the password. So let's start there, because you never know if I fat fingered that information. Oh, you got to love it when things blow up. All right, so let's come over here, the query editor. Okay, I typed the password correct here. I'm going to go fix it in my variable off screen. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the the variable name to be SQL password instead. All right, so once again, you're not seeing what I'm doing, folks. I am fixing things off screen, saving that. Okay, so I verified that at least I think I know what my password is, which is always good. And by the way, there's other places you could do this. Another place you might store your password would be in Key Vault, and there's a Key Vault task. You can pull it out through that as well. Oh, sorry, that's a failed one. I need to edit. Oh, I never brought my variable group in. That was the problem. So I did this variable group. There it is, called SQL passwords. You can link it to the entire release, or you can specify that the variables are specific to a particular stage. So I'll set up to private dev, hit link, and so now you can see that I've got a variable called SQL password. And so now if we go to tasks, someone at home was saying, you didn't link your variables. You didn't link your variables. And so I'll put that in there.
Feel like you were trying to test me to see if I was
you're mentally at the beach, man. You're dreaming of the beach. All right, so do that. And now what we'll do is we'll hit create release, and we'll run that. There we go. Okay. So yeah, that's running. And while that does that, let me grab let me go over to this browser here. And we're going to go to another demo I have, and I'll show you what it looks like if you actually ran tests as part of the deployment. Here. And I realized I've been going a long time, folks. This is way longer than I thought I would be. I apologize. In fact, I have to get done by 2 o'clock. So we're almost there. So if we look at releases here, this one does both the web app and the database, and it even runs the unit tests as part of the release. So what I do is I'm using the SSDT unit test project. It's in there. I update the connection string based upon my environment information. And you can see there's stuff down there. It does token replacement. And then it runs the database unit test in this environment, and then it does the app deploying, assuming that succeeds. So you do this in dev, test, etc. Just you would take this out for prod, obviously, because you'd be working with real data. All right, so let's go back and take a look. It is successful. So now let's prove that it was successful by coming over here, refreshing this screen. It's going to say, yes, do you want to leave? Because we're going to make you log in again. And we'll give it a second. This time we'll do Brian. Expand the tables. And now if we look at my table, there's my new field. And of course, the table still should have my data in it because I made it nullable. Oh, it helps if you do select. But it's just a table name. Why can't you read my mind? There we go. And huzzah, there's all the data. And then, of course, his MVP is null. Now, naturally, I could have initialized this by having a post-processing script to set those as 0. And then you might be wondering, okay, well, this was a great simple demo. What about the real world? Well, the real world gets complicated, so just a few things to think about, which is why I do this for a living. Number one, people and process. People are going to change the database outside your tools. That creates what we call drift, and you got to think about how you're going to handle that. Another thing to consider is multiple apps using the same database. That means it gets much more complicated to coordinate things. For those type of situations, I like to put the database manager in its own project and have a V team that coordinates access to it so that everybody knows when changes are being made to the database structure. How do you update the database and app together? What about data motion, which is I need to split a column. I need to move data from one table to another. That's where SSDT gets more complicated, where people sometimes like migrations a little better. We talked about static data loading, right? And probably a big one is compliance, compliant test data. This is a big one. Oh, I'll just grab data from production. You probably should do that if you have HIPAA, if you have PII data. There's all sorts of reasons not to be taking data from prod. So this is where it gets much more complicated. But the bottom line is with some good communication, aka the people, and a good documented process and some tools, you can really take control of your database and bring DevOps to that part of the world, just like you have with other parts of your app. Probably the biggest thing I have for everybody, dear listeners and watchers, is don't be an old fart. Just because you haven't seen it work before doesn't mean you can't try again, and embrace the DevOps mindset of growth and change. So thank you very much for watching. Esteban, I appreciate you having me. Here's my contact information. And you can reach out to me on Twitter is probably the easiest way, which is at Brian Randell. Otherwise, any last thoughts, Esteban?
No, I just want to thank you for being here with us and imparting such great knowledge. I think you're right. I think a lot of what a lot of these changes are going to rely on people communicating and being aligned on what we're trying to achieve. It's not just about the tools. It's really about just embracing new things and understanding that this is really to help everyone get to production a little faster. So great. Thank you so much, Brian, again. And for those of you watching at home, either live or later, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you here